Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing the effect of pop culture on our perception of history and the paranormal. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or about any other podcast platform. So what Dark Ozarks subject has been impacted the most by pop culture?
There are several possible answers, really, from the repackaging of our shared experiences in the form of commercialized entertainment to the expression of changing anxieties and fears through the 20th and 21st centuries in the form of our changing views on the paranormal, aliens, and things that go bump in the night, to a growing list of cliches and urban legends that leave out the best part of what really happened. It's a hard choice.
We will return to the question of how culture has fooled you about dark history and everything that scares you in a minute. But first, we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Oh, great stuff. And great stuff tonight.
So, you were saying earlier you were abducted by aliens.
Yes. They took me for Valentine's Day, and brought me back rather rapidly. Converted me into a Razorbacks fan, and I only have a few memories of the experience.
Well, that's probably a good thing. It is. There might be probing memories.
Well, of course, I might have just fallen asleep watching X-Files. It's hard to see.
And the fact that everyone could joke through and laugh through that is pop culture.
It is. And for tonight, it's Demon Aliens.
Is that different than Alien Demons? That's what I want to know.
Depends on the portal.
Okay.
It's one. This is a first for us. It's not a first for the topic. It is a first that this is our focus topic. Usually, elements of tonight's topic in terms of paranormal, pop culture, ufology, etc., wind their way into nearly any discussion that we're talking about. And tonight, those things that always wind their way in, that is the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is probably not a bad thing just to set the stage with the definition of pop culture itself. It's one of those things that we typically we recognize often, but it is, sometimes it's hard to fully wrap your head around because we're so immersed in pop culture as a whole. And I think that is interesting. For me, it's typically Scooby-Doo and X-Files and Star Trek references, but and Supernatural at this point. But what would be your broad definition of pop culture?
I think, because I actually went through some definitions this afternoon thinking about this, and the elements that basically pretty much come up over and over is a means of communication, and usually entertainment, but it can also be even forms of news and politics that is aimed at everyone, and that everyone in a society pretty much across the board at a given moment sort of gets the inside reference on whatever. So it's distinguished from high, quote, high culture, which would be more academic, more highfalutin, we're not talking about the opera and literary fiction. And it's also distinct from folk culture, which folk culture and pop culture, I think, are merging more now than they have in the past. And maybe some of the, sort of the experts in the field might disagree, but folk culture usually is sort of the ordinary person, usually a rural culture, salt of the earth, so to speak. So, for instance, I think a good example would be, say, like a conjuring woman. Typically, in the past, that would be folk culture. A conjuring woman or a granny witch. But now, pop culture has more and more embraced some of the topics that would traditionally be folk culture. And that does include not only, say, witchcraft, voodoo, but the paranormal as well.
It does. And you jump ahead into particularly TV, paranormal related TV. I think that we really are beginning to see our folk culture being introduced, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. I think the moment that it happened was the second time the Winchester brothers decided to hunt a rougarou.
Well, if you want to reference Supernatural, we can, there are a number of episodes that actually take place in the Ozarks, and there's only one place that they hunt twice, and that's actually Carthage, Missouri.
Agreed. Agreed. Oh, which I love. And
yeah,
it's, and these subjects, oftentimes you do have to not get too high up on your academic pedestal in terms of appreciating it, but also appreciating how it is intertwining awareness with entertainment.
It is. And another aspect of it is, by definition, it can be transient, because what is pop culture today in 5 years may not be. And and as we were talking, I was actually just thinking that with the paranormal, there's actually an example that at one point, the paranormal and spiritualism in particular probably were not pop culture only, but it was high culture during the mid 1800s, and then a resurgence around World War I. Spiritualism, in a lot of regards, became high culture because it was the intellectual class that really pursued it. Including people like Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yes, and that is something that a number of people, I feel, are oftentimes very surprised with, especially with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The fact that he is regarded as such he's so British, as such a post-Enlightenment figure of rationality through his character of Sherlock Holmes. I think it takes many people by surprise that he was a proponent and studier of spiritualism.
That's true. Other examples would be Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla,
Yes.
Albert Einstein, in fact, was interested in spiritualism and the paranormal.
We're really talking in many cases, whether it's literature, or technology, or science, many of the great minds, the great thinkers, or the men behind the scenes, or individuals, or women behind the scenes, with Madame Blavatsky comes to mind, of individuals who really were crossing that threshold many, many times, that sometimes we're very well aware that they did so, other times not. And you could say that it is certainly their quest for knowledge, if not an actual penetration of the metaphysical, but their quest for knowledge certainly has magically impacted the 20th century. And of course, as evidenced by the history of the 20th century, not all of that magic was good.
True. And by the same token, those individuals might be a little surprised at the current pop culture state of the subject of the supernatural.
That could be very fair. And I think that the reference to the spiritualism being high culture, beginning in New England, beginning in upstate New York, and it to varying degrees transitioning from this almost Chautauqua style study to something that is a bit more P.T. Barnum.
Well, there you go, because you really, the beginnings of pop culture, particularly in North America, kind of sit at P.T. Barnum's feet.
They do. They do. And I think that certainly with the paranormal as a focusing lens, but pop culture as a whole, so many of the things that we love and hate simultaneously about American culture is tied to this constant pull that could be surprising when you realize that it's something that has really been innate in American culture or United States culture since the inception of the nation. This constant pull between refinement and high society and complete bombastic carnivalesque capitalism that is always warring. And in so many cases, what seems to be the case is that you have anger, conflict, disgust, all of these things arising out of it at the time. And then you give it 50 years, and if we're still aware of it, it's regarded with love, sentimentality, nostalgia. It's the good old days. Could we just go back to when we used that typeface? And everything was greatest show on earth. And never mind about the poor elephant and Edison.
We digress. That's a different story.
Yes, it is. But again, I would consider, the implication of almost I use this term metaphorically, not literally, but the effect of dark magic, the idea of the turning of our technology. You look at for example, comparing the 1893 Columbia Exposition, the White City that was created seemingly out of nothing, seemingly out of the mud and the marsh of a particular area of Chicago that was heretofore unusable land, suddenly becomes the White City, the city of the future, the city of lights.
And H.H. Holmes, but
yes, yes, and 1893. Oh, it's a rapid march of industrial technology and a short march to the horrors of World War One.
Exactly. I think that you touched a little bit on this dichotomy, talking about the tension between sort of high society and bombastic capitalism, but also it's also a type of thinking and education and immersing ourselves in culture as well as how we deal with the world. And I really found it interesting a comment that James McPherson made in his book, Abraham Lincoln and the Second American Revolution, that he makes the argument that Lincoln was more effective than Jefferson Davis in leading their respective countries because of his experience with everyday people and rural culture, that, as he says, they felt that the classroom of daily experience in which Lincoln articulated was far more valuable than the excellent training in the classics in rhetoric, logic, literature, and science that Davis enjoyed. And those experiences gave him a rhythm of natural expression in key with natural life and an understanding of that natural life that allowed him to be more effective.
Yes, and I found that fascinating.
And I think there is something to that. I think that now I think the sort of flip side of that is Lincoln had the advantage that he could move in both circles because he had the ability to engage in rhetoric and science, etc., very effectively. And so in reality, I think if you can be effective in both spheres, that's the key. And one or the other gives you a disadvantage if you don't have that ability. But many that end up in sort of leadership roles or big CEOs, that kind of thing, often don't have that everyday experience that sometimes they can sort of lose the forest for the trees. And I did find that fascinating. I guess a nice reference point is, now was a couple of weeks ago we talked about Lincoln in the Ozarks. Well, Jefferson Davis has a connection to the Oklahoma Ozarks. His first post in the U.S. Army in the 1830s was Fort Gibson.
Wow, that is interesting. And it's coming back to Lincoln, I think his his reality as something of a folk hero, and of course the implication of that quote is that Lincoln understood the pop culture of his era better than Davis. That
definitely.
That the pop culture of that time was a heavily rural America that was either impacting frontier settlement or had recently impacted frontier settlement, and that we're also dealing with such a rapid approximately 30 year expansion, at which point the far west of the United States was a constantly moving target. And you saw the expansion, and of course this is relevant to the Ozarks because the Ozarks were included in that expansion, with beginning with the Louisiana Purchase, and then of course Missouri becoming a state, so approximately 1804, 1803, 1804, and then 1821, and then moving forward to the Civil War, that you see Missouri and Arkansas at crucial points of creating culture as the nation moved westward, and that had to have created a certain amount of tension with the New England culture, which had, of course, considered itself the nation
for a very long time, really, even pre-Revolution times.
And suddenly you have the nation including a lot more moving parts and a lot more perspective that was rougher, much less refined, much less at times, much less emphasis on etiquette. And you read the early, for example, the Schoolcraft's references to Potosi, Lewis and Clark's references to St. Charles, and they are in times less than diplomatic, because you're talking about Easterners who are suddenly interacting with Westerners.
Yes, well, and basically being set down in, quote, the middle of nowhere.
Yes, very, very much. And I still find it really fascinating. To me, again, we're looking at the fact that this, on one hand, you might think, oh, that's relegated to dusty history books, but these points of development not only inform culture today, but in reality, they're informing pop culture today, whether people realize it or not. Many of the perspectives that individuals in, say, rural Missouri, as opposed to more urban areas, etc., these are inclinations that are passed down from person to person, from generation to generation, and they do impact our culture. They impact us at a very molecular level, our knee-jerk responses to certain situations.
Very much so, and having lived in St. Louis, going to law school, I always found it interesting, the sort of in-state versus out-state dichotomies, and I would have to laugh. But there is that sense. There really is.
Yes, and even now, I think that there's a point of unwillingness to cross those boundaries, unwillingness to cross the borders of thought, and oftentimes it is the more highfalutin perspectives that are unwilling to entertain the idea of slumming with the highly pragmatic, but at the same time a bit rougher thoughts.
Well, and it could be more subtle than that. and actually a particular incident, actually in law school, comes to mind. It was in some class, actually trial class, I believe, and the discussion turned to trial presentation, and the discussion went to accents and the fact that the more Southern accent you have tends to be more effective as a trial attorney, because it tends to be more reassuring to a jury. And then there was a discussion between certain people there that were from the East Coast generally, sort of looking down their nose, and in particular commented on my accent and one other person in the class who happened to be from Fayetteville. And Doug purposefully laid on the accent as heavy as he could, and before it was over with, they had nothing to say.
Oh, I love that.
But
And
it's just an illustration of that tension.
it is, and these are elements that are continuing to heavily impact our nation and just the substrate of the discussions, from a sociological perspective, from political perspectives, across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that coming back to Lincoln, the brilliance that we're looking at and we're discussing of Lincoln was that he could see both sides.
Exactly. And so it's easy to say, one makes you more effective or the other, but I really think it is that combination of being able to fit in either world.
It does.
As appropriate.
It does. And what is interesting, and I think that this is effective in our discussion moving ahead tonight on the topics for tonight's episode, but there is inherent contradiction in someone who can effectively see both sides, because both sides are, by their nature, they are sides. And the average person has a tendency to be pulled into one camp or the other, along with the requisite tribalism and the requisite conflict against one's foe, etc. And it is a comparatively more rare individual who can truly step into both sides simultaneously.
Well, lesson that I learned a long time ago was that you better understand the opposing argument better than your opponent, and
Yes.
be able to argue both sides just as effectively.
Yes, and in that space and that concept, it to me is extremely reminiscent of an old magic concept, which is the Druidic position of simply existing within liminal space.
Exactly.
The old Celtic ways are not quite as dead as some people would suggest.
No, at least not in all quarters.
And I think coming off of that for just a moment, very interesting quote said by a critic of P.T. Barnum, who we've already referenced just a bit, was a great quote saying that P.T. Barnum's implied motto or life motto was lie and swindle as much as you please, but be sure to read your Bible and drink no brandy.
Touche.
It's I also found this an interesting reference again in terms of pop culture, and it's a reference to the New York Sun. And in summer of 1835, the New York Sun announced that the British astronomer Sir John Herschel had made quote astronomical discoveries of the most wonderful description. By the way, quick source citation on this is Birth of American Popular Culture from digitalhistory.uh.edu. And the Sun began circulating the the story that with Herschel's new and powerful telescope, he had discovered planets and other solar systems, and most remarkably, the winged inhabitants of the moon. And as a result, the great moon hoax, the sun's circulation soared from 10,000 to 19,000. And that wasn't the only thing that they did like that. So,
No.
So we've had a, I mean, we're talking about 1835 and aliens.
Yes. And then, basically, that is sort of that beginning of pulp publishing on a broad scale that basically made a lot of pop culture possible. Every time you go to the grocery store and you pass by the National Enquirer, whatever, it's the same thing. And amazingly, there's still, those broadsheets are still in business.
I just miss Bat Boy, and I really want to know what he's doing, because presumably he's an adult now, but considering the copyright infringement of growing up, he cannot be referred to as Batman. Simply has to be referred to as Bat Person, and he may be depressed about that. And I want to know.
Oh,
these are the things that I think about while I'm getting ready to pay for it.
I think you've stood in line in the grocery store too many times.
Well, one's mind does strange things while contemplating 6 different varieties of cured beef jerky.
Duly noted. Gosh, away from the beef jerkies.
Yeah, there's over the past 2.5 years of Dark Ozarks podcast, there's a growing list of things that my friends and colleagues know to keep me away from. Otherwise, occurrences and incidences of unfortunate cultural portent may occur.
Yes, if anyone's wondering, we do keep a list.
Yes, they do. I'm deep down, I'm grateful. So, one of the, coming back to P.T. Barnum, there is, and I think it is part and parcel, certainly with the unaccounted for voyeurism and desire for thrill, I think, that comes along with simply being human. But it could be argued that America does this a bit more bombastically than other regions. The United States specifically does this better than some other areas of the world. This headlong rush for the exciting, the grotesque, the thrilling, the unknown, and just going over the list of some of the things that P.T. Barnum perpetuated and transitioned into pop culture. And don't worry, many of these things have references, continuations for today. One of his exhibits was a woman that was interesting, named Joyce Heth, whom he claimed was 161 years old and had served as George Washington's nursemaid. And at her death, an autopsy showed that she was 80 years old. Other things were the Fiji mermaid, which had the head of a monkey and the body of a fish. I actually have a story almost associated with that. The 25-inch tall General Tom Thumb, Jumbo, an immense white elephant, and then transitioning into characters that even in his own day, we talked a lot in our Missouri to Texas episodes, we talked a lot about Davy Crockett and the fact that he became a dime novel, almost a comic hero, larger than life hero who was fictionalized even while he was still alive before he was killed.
I mean, that's very, very true. And it was it became a way of sort of selling expansionism.
Good point. Very good point.
And I think that is part of why America does it well, is that since we have prided ourselves on being a nation built on individualism, which is a bit of a contradiction to a lot of historical reality, but we paint ourselves as individualists so that we can step outside of our more parochial cultures, either our folk culture, high culture, or whatever, and so that there's an atmosphere that there can be a more universal shared experience than in a lot of societies.
I agree. And you do have to take into consideration the sometimes ugly, sometimes exciting, sometimes tragic, sometimes extraordinarily successful, sometimes bought out and remade by the industrialist American experiment of this process. It was an experiment. You do have to realize, I mean, there were things that were being tried out that did include, but were not limited to, individuality, but included aspects that there were genuine draws and genuine space of expansion, genuine places for individuals and families that were unbelievably appealing to others. And looking at the mass migration of predominantly German families in the 1830s and 1840s into the St. Louis area, they weren't coming just for the fun of it. They were coming because they believed in an idea, but they also believed in the access to opportunity and resource that clearly, on a very, again, coming back to that academic idea versus lived experience, the life they were living in Germany following the wars of continental Europe were devastating, and they were looking at a place to build, and they did, sometimes tragically, but oftentimes very, very successfully. And they were also a huge driving force and driving cultural force in ultimately making Missouri into a union state, largely against the will of rural Missourians who had been residing in the state a lot longer than the German immigrants in the St. Louis and along St. Louis area and along the Missouri River to Jefferson City.
Yeah, I mean, it's to some degree, I mean, that's very true of pretty much every group that immigrated. There was such a rigidity in society in Europe, things had gotten to the point where it was very rigid. And so, reality or not, the idea of individualism and upward mobility as a possibility was preferable to the reality that so many people lived in Europe at the time, that just the possibility was more of a draw than staying where they were.
Yes, and in many cases, understandably so, and they were willing to risk their lives in order to do that.
Risk everything they had, yeah. And I think by embracing that image, America created a sense of fluidity that allowed people to arrive, and in part, since even if it's a couple of generations back, everyone is from somewhere else, it gives a sense of a more common experience on some level that allows popular culture to thrive, I think.
I would agree. I think that's a really good point, because we are all from elsewhere, and we are a new nation. I think that is something that, for other parts of the world, Europe obviously comes to mind, but the fact that in many parts of the world, legacies have existed for thousands of years, we don't typically have that. For us, an old building is 80 or 90 years old. A really, really old building is something that was built in the late 1700s.
And, for a lot of people, it's not uncommon to be living in a 300-year-old house.
Yes, as a matter of course, as opposed to a 7-year-old house.
Exactly. So it does. I do think that the idea and the atmosphere created a reality, at least for attitude and for ability to aspire to certain things, and popular culture played into that and was fostered by it. I
agree.
One of the next big things, of course, were dime novels and traveling theater, which, you did have in Europe, but I think it was seemed more prevalent in North America in the 1800s and early 1900s. All kinds of, not only, after the Civil War, P.T. Barnum went into the circus world, but you had minstrel shows, later you had vaudeville, and it would incorporate so many different types of entertainment, and they would go town to town. It was known as the kerosene circuit, that unless you were in one of the big cities like New York or Philadelphia that had theaters that had these shows in one place all the time, and now pretty much Broadway would be the only thing that would be analogous. You had all kinds of traveling companies that would come into town and play a couple of nights, and then they'd be off to the next town. And but by doing that, you had the same entertainment across the country, basically. So that I even hate to say this, but it's almost like how today people go to McDonald's or someplace like that because they know what to expect.
Right.
And so they had the same experience whether they were in Pennsylvania or Missouri or California with these shows, and it created a common reference.
It did. And it was something that heavily impacted and shaped, but was also shaped by rural America, which is an aspect that I think post World War II that our culture has really struggled with. It is interesting, and I'm going to play with some fun sources because I am fixed to reference Beverly Hillbillies, Dukes of Hazzard, Hee Haw, and Supernatural at basically the same time. And what is interesting on that is that the possibility that with shows like Supernatural, and there are others as well, but Supernatural is the one I'm most familiar with because of the Black Impala, and Dean Winchester is my spirit animal. So what can I say? But but in that regard, a really beautiful reinsertion of rural America into public consciousness took place with Supernatural, but it was done in a very unanticipated package with through the CW. That instead of slick, sexy vampires, you're getting basically Route 66, Dukes of Hazzard, and the Duke Boys, but presented in a way that would be palatable for the 2010 to 2020 audience, but suddenly being introduced to, as you previously noted, the concept of conjures, the concept of rural Americana, or the concept of rural folklore, and even, and I think this is an interesting aspect, the repackaging of some of that cowboy individualism, and also just the idea that rural people aren't stupid, that that was largely missing from about 30 years of American TV programming.
That's a good point, and it was refreshing that one, it was set mainly in mid-America, small towns, and you got a lot of that sense of the average person, and it was the everyman. Let's face it, the Winchesters are the everyman character winning.
It is
against all odds,
and that is reminiscent of, interestingly enough, two shows, Dukes of Hazzard being one of them, which I grew up absolutely loving. And fortunately, my Basset Hound is happy that he didn't end up getting named Flash, but that and Roscoe P. Coltrane is my hero, just in case anybody wonders. But that, but also the Beverly Hillbillies, and I'm going to make an interesting reference to an Ozarks tourism icon that oftentimes gets disparaged, and I live right next to it, so I'm not going to disparage it. But perhaps for perhaps surprising reasons. The Beverly Hillbillies, along with Green Acres and Petticoat Junction, were TV shows that came onto, I believe, CBS, and were just part of this rural dynamic until the powers that be canceled them, despite their ratings, because they did not want the network associated with rural hillbilly America. And the Beverly Hillbillies in particular. So I'm going to tie this around to the Toby shows. And the Toby shows were part of that traveling minstrel concept, the vaudeville minstrel show. And it is largely lost thanks to the efforts at Shepherd of the Hills and the Homestead and Farm, as well as actor, writer, preservationist, historian, and comedian Jay McFerrin here in Branson, originally from the, I believe, Cape Girardeau, the Boot Heel area, Flatland, southeast Missouri, that the Toby Show was resurrected. and for a modern audience. For people who are unfamiliar, this was extremely popular. There were many Toby shows, and the theme is that the city slicker comes into town who knows everything. He is going to cheat the dumb hillbillies or the dumb rural people, and it would be tailored to individual regions out of their land for a variety of reasons. And the process, if it was more in the Southwest or the South, it was because he's saying that there's oil involved, et cetera. It just sort of depends on the region. And at the end of the drama, which is a comedy, that the hillbilly proves that he knew what was going on all along. He was smarter than the city slicker, and the city slicker, the city shyster, con man, is himself conned. And this is, first of all, it's incredibly powerful. There is an innate written in self-awareness, because the rural folks understand, not only do they understand how to function in defense against the city folks, but they also understand how the city folks perceive them.
Mm-hmm.
And in so doing, understand it well enough that they can play the game better on both sides.
Which takes us right back around to the argument about Lincoln.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And there's also a great, don't think we're going to go into it tonight, but a great segue, we've done it before, of the fearsome creature, the fearsome critters, the folk tales that you just tell the windiest story that you possibly can to an audience who isn't typically a sophisticated, out of town newcomer urban audience that is so smart they don't know that you're fooling them. And that is, first of all, it's incredibly powerful. Second of all, it becomes not just a plot. The Toby Show is not just a plot, it is the plot, multi-season plot of the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yes. Well,
although inverted.
Yeah. And on some level, Dukes of Hazzard, etc. as well. So
right. I can't help but make some ties whenever the Winchester brothers fool the larger powers that be, that there isn't some aspect of that. There is, showing what a complete supernatural nerd that I am, a bit of that innate built-in dichotomy between that. Sam and Dean are actually representing the two sides of the dichotomy, because Sam, of course, is more sophisticated, and Dean is more of a realist in terms of his response. Now, coming back to my near hometown, adopted hometown, Hollister, Branson. We're going to talk about Branson for just a moment. So much of the original comedy, I would say the 1970s, 1980s, what is oftentimes referred to as the golden years, the golden era of original Branson comedy. It was hillbilly comedy, and there were key hallmark points within, essentially gimmicks or shtick within that. Some shows active today still retain that. I'll name drop just a moment. Presley's Country Jubilee is one of them. Grand Country, then Grand Country Square, the shows there, the comedy show and the Grand Jubilee on Friday nights. These shows have, and there are others, those are the two that come to mind, as well as the shows that Jay McFerrin is producing out at Shepherd of the Hills. These shows follow this shtick, essentially. There is the naive hillbilly who, in all reality, actually knows what's going on better than everyone else. This is a callback to the Toby Show. It is a callback to a level of understanding about rural America and the class divides of rural America versus urban America that are extremely potent. I think they're extremely relevant. That at the same time, I've talked to so many people, I'm on my soapbox, I've talked to so many people, particularly in relationship to some of the Branson shows, who do look down on these from a point of essentially a lack of awareness that we are still dealing with a continuation of pop culture.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you don't get it, you just don't get it. I mean, that's what that comes down to. My dad used to like to walk that rope a lot, just for his own amusement, and because he, my dad was highly intellectual, mathematical, musical prodigy, engineer, etc. But he could be a walking Toby show.
Yes.
And relished in it.
Yes. And I think that there is, unless you're unaware that dynamic exists, there is extraordinary catharsis. There's also reassurance, personal reassurance in that one's, and this actually could be reflective of the larger everyman story of American history, that your ability to work hard, your simply being a person individually, that you do have autonomy, you do have personal agency, and you do have the capacity to exist within that threshold space of knowing what's going on in the larger world, but choosing your own path, even if in some cases the larger pressures of culture are deriding it.
Very true. Very, very true. I think when we're talking about pop culture, and we've been dancing around this a bit about how America seems to be more immersed in this or better at pop culture than other places, so to speak. And I think you can't really answer the question of why is that so without looking at World War II.
True. On so many levels. And I think that there are moments in time of, we're just looking at American history for a moment. Of course, this impacted world history to such a large degree, but we're in the Dark Ozarks, so we're talking about American history. And you have this situation. I think that the monolithic result of the Second World War was mass industrialization that to such a vast degree upended American strata, the culture that had been being developed for well over a century. And certainly in pockets, large, not even pockets, I would say large swaths of rural America, that this was culture that had been in development in those spaces since settlement, suddenly being upended, suddenly being, in some cases literally, in other cases figuratively, bulldozed. Culture, towns ultimately disappearing. So many, obviously Red Oak, the original one, being one of ones that we've covered most recently, and a huge push toward the population moving to urban settings, the development, the mass creation of the suburb, and in many cases the destruction or the dwindling of the small family farms, and a an entire society that transitioned pretty much in one, in living memory, and in typically one generation, from a heavily agrarian and folk culture based society to an heavily urban and industrialized society.
In the urbanization really made pop culture possible on the extensive scale that it became, but also part of the war effort itself ended up, particularly in the US and the Allies more generally, basically put into place all of the pieces to make the expansion of pop culture easier later.
Yes.
From wartime, PSA movies, and all of the effort, to be focused on, everyone focused on a certain direction and very much saturated in TV, radio, advertising, etc., that we all got on the same page, and that became a way of life. It became a habit.
It did.
That later advertisers and entertainment industries and technology used those pieces that were created and sort of put into a system during World War II. They have used that same format up until now. The technology just changes a little bit.
Agreed. And taking ourselves out of the equation for a moment, you realize that the pop culture impacts and references that we have, and we're going to get into the aliens, demons, and ghost hunting shows in a moment, so we're going to tie this in. But that there is that shared language that 80 years ago, 50 years ago, if you plucked someone out of our past and dropped them into today, it would be absolutely bewildering in terms of what we're talking about.
Yes, it would almost be like another language, so to speak.
And it's, I found myself, of course, this is, dating myself, but referencing late 1960s cartoons on a regular basis, and occasionally singing along with the theme songs. And I'm talking about Scooby-Doo. And then again, this was a shared experience. So many of us grew up as children watching these, and then, depending on the context, finding further value. And
well, exactly. There is a reason you can say the Scooby-Doo moment and people know what you mean.
Yes.
It's a shorthand.
And some, for whatever reason, and I think that there are some compelling studies that indicate certain shows are able to resonate down the years while others do not. Occasionally I find myself in discussion with, okay, what's your favorite? What was your favorite Saturday morning cartoons? And the reality that Scooby-Doo and Bugs Bunny have just continued to resonate through the ages, whereas my brief childhood fling with the Snorkels did not hold up so well.
Very, very true. Very true. And that's where I've had conversations with my sons before about them missing certain cartoons that you don't see very much anymore from their childhood, that when you think about it, they are very much akin to, say, Scooby-Doo, as far as narration and format, and there's something more universal going on.
And something that I think we're both interested in is the fact that a point of longevity tends to be shows that aren't simply a show about the thing that it's obvious about, but a show that speaks to more deep-seated, larger cultural anxieties.
Exactly. And pop culture is a way of almost being a pressure valve for those.
It is. And there's a couple of key ones that come to mind. Of course, dealing with Scooby-Doo and the ghost hunting shows. Mm-hmm. I think the larger cultural anxieties of we have bad guys that we can't see and that we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly the Scooby Gang is going up against bad guys that they can't see, because instead of the guy, it's a ghost, a witch, a ghost robot. That one was fun. So on and so forth. And then by the end of the tidy, colorful, somewhat psychedelic episode, that the villain has been the impossible to wrap your head around villain. The negative phenomena has been unmasked as just a regular guy with regular motives, like a bank robber. And right. All is set right with the world. And he would have made it too if it had been for those kids and that dog. And there's a universal sense of catharsis. As children, we could watch it and experience the catharsis of Scooby-Doo winning at the end. But as we grew up, those unseen but dark forces that we began to become aware of begin to, we experience catharsis at a different level.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Very true. And for anyone wondering about the Ozarks, there is an episode of Scooby-Doo about the Ozarks.
And there was an interesting point of discussion. I'm going to jump back to the Beverly Hillbillies for a moment. And there's a direct ties with the Beverly Hillbillies mm-hmm. and the Ozarks. The creator of the Beverly Hillbillies was Paul Henning. Paul Henning was from the Kansas City area, but he had vacationed and camped as a boy in the Ozarks many, many times. And he had an abiding love, not only for the Ozarks, but also hillbilly culture. And of course, that informed him in creating the characters of the Beverly Hillbillies. The Beverly Hillbillies were written in as at times coming home near to Silver Dollar City.
Right. Kirbyville is what they would usually say.
And the connection there, the young Silver Dollar City, because Silver Dollar City opened over Marble Cave in 1960. So Silver Dollar City was, at the time, I believe, less than 10 years old, and highly ambitious marketing folks at Silver Dollar City managed to get the theme park written into several episodes of the Beverly Hillbillies. And so the Clampetts returned home to Silver Dollar City and were filmed on the park. It was a huge moment of marketing for the theme park, which was still quite young. A huge moment for Taney County and Branson, etc., because millions of people watched the show and then wanted to go visit the theme park that was the home of the Clampetts, or the visiting, going back to the mountains. But there was a capitalized theme that was going on. The 1950s, 1960s, because we know that we survived in the 1950s and 1960s without a nuclear holocaust, can look back at the 20 years, the Vietnam War, etc., and regard it with a certain amount of nostalgia. But at the time, existing for the first time under the threat of nuclear annihilation. And you combine that with the deep anxiety of having taken a majority of Americans and transitioned them from an agrarian society into an urban industrialized corporate society almost overnight. I mean, in the scope of world history, in the blink of an eye, taking statistically significant majorities of the population and moving them from farm to city. And these hillbilly themes, whether it was with Silver Dollar City, whether it was with Branson, whether it was with the Beverly Hillbillies, and all of this is tied to the Ozarks, spoke profoundly to those anxieties.
They did, and of course, from the artistic standpoint, they're just opposing it to Beverly Hill, as opposed to Beverly Hills. I always was amused in the episodes where they would refer to going to here they're living in Beverly Hills, but they would be talking about home and going to the big cities of Springfield and Joplin.
Yeah.
So it's all relative.
It is. And, I think that there's something, one of the things that Ozarks tourism, and of course, this was a huge chapter in Ozarks tourism, that Ozarks tourism did, including at times making our roads impassable because there were so many people on them, was created a deep and abiding appreciation for something as simple as Ozark craftsmanship and Ozark crafts. And I think that there's something very powerful in that, because yes, you're living your somewhat unanticipated fragile existences in new suburbia, with all of the requisite stressors of that, and you're living under the threat of nuclear annihilation if you listen to the news, and a constant barrage of what we, in all fairness, may be contemporary stress that we've more effectively acclimated ourselves to. We've grown up with the bombardment of news, the bombardment of threat, the bombardment of sort of our daily ritual of, oh my gosh, are we going to survive this litany that a previous generation was not as accustomed to.
Well, and the flip side of that is that some of the heightened sense of anxiety and uncertainness that is going on now, I've read articles hypothesizing this, and I've wondered it myself, that for people who are a little younger than us, having a hard time dealing with sort of uncertainties and everything, may be related to why we perceive them not dealing with those issues as well, is that they never knew that sense of, the annihilation could come at any moment.
Yes.
And so you had to live with that at the back of your mind and go on. And that existential threat went away in the early 90s, but the social stresses didn't. And so it's like the subconscious worries about annihilation so you can deal with the present, but now that's gone, so they haven't quite figured out what to do yet.
And unfortunately, the snorkels did not have a lot to say about these factors. And one, just perhaps to wrap this aspect of it up, coming back, something that has become almost a side genre for the fandom of Supernatural is the fact that Sam and Dean and other characters in the storyline, but particularly Sam and Dean's travails have spoken very effectively and sometimes very existentially as well to the subject of mental health.
That's true. I mean, that is true. That was an ongoing theme. And it also kind of illustrates that those issues can be looked at from different perspectives. And for some, that literally could be a supernatural issue, could be mental illness to someone else.
Right, which is a pretty powerful observation. And and I can say for myself, I've been watching Supernatural for a long time. I haven't completely finished the series, so no spoilers. But ironically, when things in my life got better, I was less apt to watch it religiously. And there was a certain aspect, and I think that this speaks to pop culture, the effects, sometimes the very positive effects of pop culture. But when things were really rough in my life, there was something very cathartic about tuning in and realizing that Sam and Dean had broken the world and started the apocalypse again, and yet weren't or died, and had somehow managed to, if not succeed, at least just to keep going.
Exactly. Does remind me of the episode where they are defeating the British men of letters, and the two hunters are brought in that killed them once and are surprised to see Sam and Dean, and says, "Hi, we haven't seen you since you killed us."
Yeah, just keep going. And there was, as cheesy as it might sound, there was something that's very powerful in terms of speaking narratively to the human experience, because I can personally say there were points that I would find myself going, well, if Sam and Dean can handle this next round of the apocalypse, I could probably go to work in the morning.
Fair. Oh,
Yeah.
That might be a good segue into pop culture and the paranormal overall. And we really went from monster movies of the 30s and B movies of the 50s and 60s to sort of the beginning of the change would be maybe Rosemary's Baby in the late 60s, but really The Exorcist
Yes.
really changed things for pop culture and the whole subject of the paranormal.
It did, to such a vast degree. And as regulars with Dark Ozarks, trivia note, will already know, the actual events that inspired The Exorcist, the majority of those events took place in the St. Louis metro area, not on the East Coast.
Exactly. Real case that happened over a course of months in the St. Louis area. So definitely an Ozarks connection. And as a teaser, we may force Josh to watch The Exorcist on camera for his reaction, since disclosure, you've never actually seen it.
I've never actually seen The Exorcist. Yes, full confession. And I've seen clips. I know what the story's about. I've read a book on the original case files, but I have not actually seen the film. So I think that would be fun, and I'm totally up for it. So
Popcorn, and we need to do that. We'll have to do that sometime.
I'm going to be picking out my favorite canned soup for the occasion.
Pea soup. It's gotta be pea soup.
I know. And full circle with Supernatural. Linda Blair made a guest appearance on a Supernatural episode.
Actually, one of my favorite episodes.
Mine too. Oh, mine too. I have it on DVD. And that, of course, I think that folklore itself has always denoted a certain element of fear regarding the supernatural, fear or trepidation. You can't read, Sleepy Hollow. You can't go over the old Scots-Irish folk tales without people being afraid of something.
Well, that's true. That's true. But we had gotten to a point in America where the supernatural was a parlor game. I mean, people did seances and the Ouija board on Friday night, and it was family fare, and it was not viewed with the trepidation and fear that it is now until William Peter Blatty wrote The Exorcist, and then the movie, which he wrote the screenplay. He adapted his own book for this for the movie into screenplay. And to be honest, I mean, it's a good example of you would not consider the book high culture by any means, and so it falls into pop culture, but it's extremely well written, and I think it's a really good example that pop culture can be good and not cheesy. I think sometimes people just equate pop culture with being cheesy.
I agree, and something that I find at times bemusing, at times frustrating, is that in many cases, what we now regard as high culture began as pop culture.
Very true. Very, very true. Shakespeare is a good example of that.
Yes, I find that probably the most compelling aspect, and certainly a strong argument for not placing some of this culture too high on a pedestal or too low.
Exactly. Just enjoy. I mean, that's one thing. But I think it was the reaction that people had to the movie that was the signal of change to come. This was, as far as I know, the first time. I mean, you had people running out of the theater. You had people passing out and fainting in the theater. And, really signaled there's something different here, so to speak. And it definitely resonated. And it's at this point that you start getting discussions of, a lot of things that are satanic, demonic. The Ouija board is now evil, and things like that, that prior to that just were not in the consciousness.
125 years of classy spiritualism wiped out with one film.
Exactly. High culture wiped out. Which again is a testament to Blatty's talent, but it still amuses me that we are still dealing with the fallout from that 50 years later.
Well, and the on a simple level, the pop culture reference of pea soup is instantly understandable, even by people like me who've never seen the film. But things that I grew up under a rock, but that doesn't mean that I stayed there. That at the same time, certain conventions are inured within society, and just dealing with the concept of demonology is, and of course we see this echoed many times in supernatural, but not solely in supernatural. For example, everyone seems to know what holy water does, whether it does that or not. And everyone knows what an exorcism is, even if they can't describe one in actuality. Everyone knows how these things are supposed to work. And I would say that this not only heavily influenced American culture and the perception of the paranormal. And that was as if that wasn't large enough, then Poltergeist came along and introduced us to what we really need to be worried about in terms of Native American burial grounds. So it's full gamut. And
well, it is. I mean, and really the fixation had started to wane until about 79, and the Amityville Horror book and movie came out, which has, I mean, much of it has been recanted, and it's pretty clear that at a bare minimum, the allegations in the book and the movie were exaggerated greatly. But in pop culture, that's not the case. You know, that footnote has not been filtered through, and particularly in the paranormal circles for the audience, for the fans, you still get that carte blanche that was, entirely accurate reality. And that really affects things. Then you get Poltergeist, and then you get Ghostbusters, and you move into, I think Poltergeist kind of introduced us unwittingly to the genre of ghost hunting, even though at the time we didn't really realize it at the time. And then Ghostbusters, of course, did more so, but in a comedic aspect.
Yes.
And I think everyone was like, okay, other than having sort of the satanic cult craze and fixation for about 20 years in there, where people were just afraid that Satanists were everywhere and committing all kinds of heinous crimes that never were proven, pretty much. Then reality TV happened.
Yes. Yes, it did, along with the ghost shows and various aspects. I think the thing that comes to mind off the top of my head is a comment that we got from a great attendee at one of our events. I'm not knocking what he was saying because it's very respectful. But I remember the subject of shadow people, shadow men being brought up, and he said, well, if it's black, it means it's demonic, right? And again, I'm not, we welcome the interaction, we welcome the feedback, we welcome these discussion points. They're very important. And many people who are very certainly very interested or very engaged, oftentimes their only port of entry or point of entry for the subject are the TV shows, are the films, are the reality shows, and having to filter everything through that commercial lens. And so at the same time, the idea that almost a matter of fact, this is how this is. No, not necessarily. These things work very differently. It also, and I may get something thrown at me for this one, not by you, is this cottage industry of exorcisms and cleansings that seem to have arisen out of response. And I'm going, guys, this doesn't work.
Yourself exorcisms.
I know. And there are a number of very effective and intelligent ways of certainly perhaps brightening a space through traditional folk ritual. And those are lovely. I have been known to engage in those, not to banish something, but simply because I like to do it. But to, hang out a shingle and say, exorcisms and banishments are us. My sage and I will be over shortly upon request. Without realizing it, we're stepping into another pop culture cliche, which is whatever you need, you can just order it up.
Yes, and that everything has a 5-minute resolution.
Yes.
Fast food service, please.
Yes. But sorry, your ghost is not a Happy Meal.
Right. And there's a lot of people who get really just upset at the fact that, when you say no, that, it doesn't always work that way, because there seems to be a pretty large disconnect with a lot of people on that it has to be resolved like that. It can just, and I said to someone a while back, they were talking about this, and I finally said, if you really think that anything can be gotten rid of with a sage bundle, don't you think that basically there would be nothing out there at this point? Because
it is unfortunately much more complex than that.
Yeah.
But then on the upside is it is also typically much less malevolent than we're being led to believe.
True.
And that can be very encouraging. That can be exciting. That can be a relief. The other thing, and I think is without realizing it, this is one of the pervasive aspects. I wouldn't consider it a negative or a positive in regards to pop culture. I would simply consider it simply is, but it is this, in this case, the things that we don't know, the things that we've learned that we don't know we've learned. And if those things are incorrect, we are poorly equipped to handle certain situations, but we think that we're highly educated on the subject. That is an unpleasant and an anxiety-inducing place to be. And it's a place to be that many of our much older past generations in primitive societies, quote unquote, primitive is in they didn't have cell phones, or TV or newspapers or trains, but they had highly advanced social and metaphysical structures to give them a sense of place within the universe and a way to navigate that place within the universe. Sometimes effectively, sometimes not, but certainly a clear and structured pathways that we're largely stripped of, and that has been replaced with pop culture. So a point, coming back to this core point that you just made, when we on the ground are approached with, I have a haunting and I don't like it, what is largely being asked without being realized that it's being asked is, please get rid of my ghost problem in 44 minutes. You go 44 minutes? Yes, 44 minutes. That's the duration of the episode.
Yeah, pretty much. And it surprises me how many people sort of just accept whatever's presented on TV as, carte blanche, full disclosure. And I think it's willful, a disconnect, that, they're telling me that it can be dealt with and this can be banished or this can be explained this easily. And so I'm good with that, because now I don't have questions.
Yes.
And I can just call someone and take care of my problem. In reality, those people often are disappointed if they do have a problem.
Yes. And we do see that, not just, with an investigative case, but just on our educational points in public events. There, an individual can arrive with their set of preconceived ideas, and when we don't agree with them for a variety of contextual reasons, there is disappointment, and sometimes a negative response.
Yeah, often I think often to me it seems that it's a disappointment that the particular TV show I identify with hasn't told me the entire truth.
Right. And quite frankly, there's no reason they have to.
No, I mean, it is entertainment. I mean, they call it reality because it's not, quote, not scripted, although that's a bit of a misnomer in most cases anyway. But it's made to look that way. And for its foibles, it has served some positive purposes.
It has.
It has. I mean, people are more aware, and in fact, studies. There's a Gallup poll, but I've seen other studies as well that about 3/4 of Americans believe that ghosts exist.
Right.
So, go ahead.
I was just saying a large number of people, and the individuals who choose to be skeptics, or because of their experiences or lack of experiences, are skeptics, which I appreciate. That they really struggle wrapping their head around this, but many people become quote unquote believers after they've had an experience with inexplicable phenomena that fits the criteria for a haunting.
True. I mean, I think that a lot of believers were skeptics until they just had something they could not explain otherwise, and it's neither here nor there whether someone is a believer or skeptic. Really, I mean, I think it's just a matter of experiences. But I think that pop culture in this instance has been a catharsis for people who've had experiences and not been able to share them or been able to openly process their experiences in the past.
And that's very positive.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's been an issue for a long time in certain segments of the population in society, but even more so after The Exorcist, that there must be something wrong with me, or I'm crazy, or because I think there's that unspoken belief that for some that, okay, if I admit that ghosts happen and everything, then I have to admit that maybe things in The Exorcist are real, and I don't want to go there. And so we just deny everything.
Yes. And certainly the hucksterism quality that surrounds, not necessarily and not specifically picking out a reality TV show, but just the many aspects of the paranormal entertainment that has existed for decades. On one hand, a positive place of communal knowledge and catharsis for individuals who have had experiences, and I think that the certain amount of personal investment in one show or another, one idea or another, it tends to come from the fact that for some, many, who've grown up in essentially a secular American society, and by secular I mean bereft of a metaphysical lore, that there's this unhinging quality of having had the experience, and then you're grasping for some solid ground, and this new solid ground becomes your new secular dogma of saying, now I thought I knew how the world worked, and then I found out I didn't know how the world worked, and now I've learned how the world worked. It's just different than what I thought it was.
That's true. And then there's another subset that did have that metaphysical lore, but the metaphysical lore that they were brought up with told them, if you have an experience, it's bad, it's evil, everything's evil. And so they had the same uncertainties, but now lots of guilt thrown on top of it, and fear. So either way, it caused problems for people, for a lot of people anyway. And so, yeah, and I agree that a lot of the shows and what's portrayed does become that sort of their own dogma, which I think explains some of the inordinate adherence and belief in some of the gadgets that, and while some devices and meters, etc., have some value, there are some that just absolutely have, defy rational belief, that you see people buy into hook, line, and sinker because they saw it on a TV show.
Like searching for EMF spikes with your cell phone?
Well, but my favorite is the SLS camera with the stick figure avatar, that there's a stick figure, so it's a ghost. And it's like, no, it's an avatar. It's reflecting off the wall or the table. And that's why it's sitting on your head, on the person's head on the camera. But people, you see it, oh my gosh, it's a ghost. It's a ghost. It's a ghost sitting on his head. Okay. Yes. Or sitting under a table in a fetal position. Okay.
I'm just going to throw it out there. When I become a ghost, I'm going to sit on people's heads. I think it would be fun. That's all I'm going to do. Just to be incredibly annoying.
Do I need to burn a sage?
That's okay. You don't have to drive me. You don't have to drive me out with sage. You can just lure me out with a bucket of fried chicken.
If I have a bucket of fried chicken, you'll never leave.
The trick is to put it outdoors.
Oh, okay.
It appears as an offering.
Okay.
And
so then when the door, so then when we get poltergeist activity and the door opens, we know you're just coming back in for more figures.
Yes, just, chicken outside, not inside. We're good. But and if somebody's wondering about the EMF, electromagnetic fields, I have watched individuals at the recommendation of tours, no names, not any around here, but at the recommendations of tours, to download essentially a K2 meter app, and then walk around looking for EMF spikes with their cell phone. And for people who are unfamiliar with that, anytime that you get a text or a phone call, your phone itself is spiking EMF through the roof.
Yeah, actually, anytime any data is sent or received,
Yes.
and so yeah, you're going to have all kinds. Um, there were several apps for several years where it would purport to be, it looked like almost a radar screen, and they'd have blips, and this is where the ghosts are, and people would seem to really buy into that, and it's like, no, whatever it is, it's just an algorithm creating something random.
Yes. And it's not
But
nearly that easy or that simple.
yes, which sort of a dichotomy for, most people don't believe everything they see on the internet, but it's almost like if we put it into a phone app or it's on TV and you're interested, then that that reasoning goes out the window. And I guess that's the next layer, is that you had the reality TV shows, and then a proliferation of content on the internet, then social media, YouTube, etc. That and a lot of it makes the reality TV shows look pretty darn scientific.
Yes. Yes, it is. But without whether we realize it or not, we're really harkening back to P.T. Barnum.
It really is. And you start watching some of the YouTube channels and just some of the clips you see, some of the stuff you see on social media regarding the paranormal, and it really does. It really harkens back to the Fiji mermaid.
So one of the things that I've found is since becoming am I an official or unofficial member of Paranormal Science Lab at this point? I don't know.
You're definitely a member.
Okay. I know I'm part of Dark Ozarks because I'm co-producer, but as
whether
part
you like
of
it or not.
I do like it. I like it very much. As part of the team, and certainly at public events, that individuals find at times very confounding, is that I don't watch paranormal ghost hunting shows. I am completely at a loss in terms of, I'm familiar with names at times because we have these discussions. I have initially just really wasn't in the loop because I was coming at all of this from a journalism and a folkloric and a culture standpoint, not from a paranormal standpoint. Although, I do have a strong Celtic ancestry that lends itself to sensitivity of the weird, and certainly appreciation of the weird. But which reminds me, once I saw a mermaid constructed entirely out of mud that was locked in a case, and it still gives me nightmares because I'm not sure it might not have come alive at one point and slithered into the rest of the antique shop. But the first half of that is true. The other aspect of this is that, we have folks who come and start talking to me about certain methodologies or certain individuals who are stars, and then I just say I don't know anything about that, and they look at me as though I'm the huckster for having the audacity to be involved in the paranormal and not also be involved in the pop culture reality TV show, YouTube channel genre as well.
And to be honest, I don't watch a lot of it either.
No, I know you don't.
And occasionally if I'm channel surfing and I see one, I might watch for a little bit to see what I'll do that every once in a while to see, are they doing anything different, or is this a location I'm not familiar with? But when you understand the formulas being used, you don't really need to watch them all the time.
Right. And I think there's also a certain amount of fairness to the fact that we're too busy actually doing this stuff to be busy watching it.
That's true. And I find are the ones that actually do a lot of investigation themselves and actually then have a show. They tend to be a little different perspective, and not quite as over the top pop culture wise. That may not be, hard and fast for everyone, but it is a tendency that I think the more you really investigate, it does tend to try to make you steer away from some of that pop culture incentive. Although once there's a TV show and production companies and networks involved, you don't always pull the strings either. So
very, very true. Very true. And it's the thing that I think, and it's very important to note, for any individual who is a fan of a particular show, or a fan of several of them, by all means, enjoy it. And
candidly, I'm friends with and know a lot of these people anyway, and I not disparaging them as individuals by any means.
No, nor disparaging many aspects of their research or their investigations, but it is just deeply important to understand that these are shows that are collated and formed for entertainment and for specific advertising purposes.
That at best you are getting a snapshot of a situation, not the entire situation.
Though at the same time, occasionally capturing really, really compelling evidence.
Sometimes they do.
Once in a while.
A lot of the EVPs are questionable, but
yes.
Now, a couple other things I want to go into just a little bit, because so much of this does revolve around technology as it has evolved, whether it was from mass producing newspapers and dime novels to World War II to the internet, etc. A couple more sort of almost consequences to the current pop culture phenomena regarding the paranormal. One revolves back around to books, and now there is a strong subgenre of paranormal romance books.
Yes.
Which is at a total 180-degree from The Exorcist and the effects of The Exorcist, where in that vein, we are terrified of the paranormal is the consequence. Now we want to sleep with the paranormal and marry it.
Yes. Sexy werewolves. And of course, in that particular reference, and interestingly enough, again, in terms of the way that pop culture inures itself into our consciousness, we recognize it even if we can't necessarily cite it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Twilight. and oftentimes, even if we have never watched it, realizing the thought process that I have just set in motion, I realized There's two films that I've not seen. One of them is Exorcist, and I hate to say it, the other is Twilight. Now I think I'm actually more afraid that y'all are going to make me watch Twilight.
Disclosure, I haven't watched it either. So.
Okay. Which
I would be more, I think I'd be more frightened to watch Twilight. I mean, I've watched The Exorcist a number of times, but I think I'd be definitely more frightened of Twilight than The Exorcist. But,
oh, okay. So,
that might be the second round is watching Twilight.
Yes, dedicated viewers weigh in. Josh, film response, film reaction to Josh watching Exorcist, film reaction to Josh and Lisa watching Twilight.
There you go. Now then, the other thing, the other sort of repercussion has been a resurgence of urban legend via the internet and stories related on the internet. So much of the pop culture urban legend bailiwick from the 50s to the 80s and even into the 90s, but particularly 50s to 80s, centered around youth culture and facing fears. And so you have your Crystal Lake legends, you have, Hatchet Man legends, those kinds of things. And advent of the internet, you have things like Slender Man now.
Yes.
Which I got asked even just a few months ago about whether it was real.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, it really, I mean, there is no question. It was a story that appeared online. It took on a real world connotation when two young girls committed murder. And cited Slender Man.
Yes.
Which at the time that happened, I almost wondered, are we going to sort of rehash the satanic cult fear of the 70s and 80s? But it kind of died out after that. But you still occasionally get people who think, oh, this must be a real thing. And there almost seems to be conflation between it and shadow men for some people.
True. Very true. I was going to bring that up, that there does seem to be that connection and that anticipation. Of course, the fear becomes associated with the appearance of shadow men.
Yeah. And
it's probably just the etymology.
Probably. And I mean, it is depicted as being dark and, black, etc. So, yes. I mean, it's almost a comic version of a shadow man. So I guess I get that. There have been a few others that have sort of raged on the internet that you really didn't hear about before. Probably black-eyed children are the one that comes to mind the most. And it wasn't a as far as we know, a purely fictional creation. There's a story of it's either out of New Mexico or Arizona, I can't remember which. It was a newspaper journalist sitting in, and he tells the story that he was seen in a parking lot writing out checks, paying bills and getting ready to drop them in the mailbox. And these children walk up and they ask to be let in, the car for a ride and everything. Notice their eyes are black, etc. And there was, something odd about them and the feeling of this is not right.
Yes.
Again, very much lore akin to vampire lore. We can't come in unless we're invited, that kind of thing. But that motif certainly spread.
It did.
Via the internet.
I do think it's fair to say that Slenderman's PR people are better than the Black Eyed Children's.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of died down, but there for several years there was a lot of stories about Black Eyed Children. Supposedly people having encounters, but it just had the feel of mass hysteria.
Right, and just in turn, there is something powerful and compelling about scaring the hell out of yourself on the internet at 1 o'clock in the morning by yourself.
That's true. And then maybe looking out your window and thinking you see something.
Yes. And I speak from personal experience on that. I had my seductive fling with the Black Eyed Children deep in the nether regions of the internet, and following that through. And of course, transitioning, going, the step-by-step process that, and this is the power of the internet, over the course of say 2 hours, you can go from a level of education that begins with what the hell is a Black-Eyed Children? Let me click here, to 2 hours of down the rabbit hole. The wind taps the willow tree against the window of the bathroom, and you nearly crap yourself to death because you're sure they're the Black-Eyed Children. Not only do you know what they are, you now know that they're after you.
I've also, I also wonder if there's a sort of a subconscious component to the Black-Eyed Children tales that is almost a response to the Men in Black phenomenon.
I think that would be interesting to chart, and a very, very interesting thing to postulate. I like that.
I mean, granted, Men in Black encounters go back much further, certainly predate the internet, and actually predate the mass consumption of stories about UFOs and abductions and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So there seems to be more of a foundation there, but for me, Black-Eyed Children seem to be almost a compilation of Men in Black and vampire lore.
That is interesting, and I think that's a very, very fair place from which to conjecture. Personally, I just blame the Kentucky Goblins, but most people who know me know I blame the Kentucky Goblins on most things, including my cell phone bill. So it's the thing about the Black-Eyed Children phenomenon in pop culture that I find really compelling, just as an aspect of culture. I'm not saying compelling as a phenomenon. First of all, just how ridiculously unsettling the description of the phenomena is.
Yeah.
And the good folks, the good folks on Creepypasta who writing the good stuff, know not to take it over the edge. I was actually clicked on it wasn't creepypasta, but just a compilation of black-eyed children stories that are on YouTube a while back, because I needed something relaxing to fall asleep by. And at one point in the story, the said narrator protagonist runs screaming out of her apartment building because the black-eyed children were floating in the air on the outside her window on the third floor. And I'm going, okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to go to sleep now because you jumped the shark. You hit the shark. And speaking of sharks, I have my own little mackerel right here. But there is the good ones, and in most cases this early internet stories that started the phenomena, or appear to have started the phenomena, were like a good vampire story, so creepy precisely because of what wasn't told rather than what was. There's
right. I mean, they really do fit as vampire lore more than anything, and to be honest, is a little reminiscent of Anne Rice, and her child vampires.
Yes, Claudia is phenomenal.
Very
and yes, from that perspective, again, we're coming back to things that speak really heavily into our psyche, and you could say that they are a creation of our psyche. In some cases, there's a very real possibility that some of this phenomena has actually occurred. We're not discounting that.
No. But in a lot of the reiterations, it relies very heavily on those cliches.
It does, but that's okay. With the understanding that this is part of this larger tapestry that is some fact, is some fiction. But the truth is that the narrative in some way speaks heavily into the human experience.
Agreed. Now, to kind of tie this together, perhaps pop culture, internet age, Ozarks. Let's torment Josh one more time with his favorite favorite critter, the Ozark Howler.
Ozark Howler. Oh my goodness. There just going to be some things that follow me, and the Howler is one of them.
But really, wouldn't you say that the Ozark Howler really has become a pop culture item?
Yes, and in that regard, certainly there's an aspect of perfect storm that you really don't know if the dog is wagging the tail or the tail's wagging the dog.
Or the cat, or whatever, or the bear.
And I have, for those of you on video, I have my favorite Ozark Howler in my lap. And he's being a little troublesome at the moment. My 10-month basset hound puppy. But for folks who are listening on audio only podcast, that's not me making those grunting noises. But he's been asleep at my feet for most of the episode. Now, along with that, the I think as we discussed earlier in earlier episodes, there is the power of the Howler, is that it is so poorly defined. It is so poorly defined as that it can be many things.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, it fits. It can be neatly tucked in. It can be neatly tucked into whatever box that you want, and as a result of that, you just, TV producer, urban legend developer, folklorist, quick fictional writer on the internet, doesn't matter. The Ozark Howler can fit into your box. It's very convenient.
Or on a billboard.
Yes.
And I think that's the sort of that, as you said, perfect storm with making it pop culture, is that you have actually something that you would originally have been folk culture that has now become mainstream, a broad awareness, that is driven by the technology of the internet and advertising.
Right. 100%. And some of it is just fun.
Oh, yeah.
And one of my favorite things is the development of the Ozark Howler dark beer at Turkey Creek Brewery.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like the beer.
It is good beer.
It really is. And there's, of course, the Ozark Howler mountain bike park on Highway 65, just north of Branson. I haven't gone out there because I don't mountain bike. I like all of my limbs to remain in an unfragmented position. So me and mountain biking are not going to be happening anytime soon. And those are fun. The thing that I found, again, confounding is when the tail starts wagging the dog, so to speak, that the larger producer powers that be in other states start calling people like us, asking us for Ozark Howler lore. And I'm going, first of all, why? Second of all, could I interest you in a snoffus? And third of all, no, I don't care. But the conversation sort of, went along in that order. But it is interesting what things punch, which buttons and why.
Very true. Very true. But that is sort of the definition of pop culture.
It is.
And it's not going to end anytime soon.
No. So as a result, I have made my peace with the Howler. The Howler and I will be writing a book series and running away together on a mountain bike trail with beer.
Just make sure there's a camera.
I will. Otherwise, I would just become a figment of my own urban legend.
Perhaps you have.
Documentation is important.
That's right. And on that note, don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we will discuss the Scots-Irish lore, history, and heritage. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.